Continuing Cato the Younger. The news did not fail to reach Rome that he was coming up the river. All the magistrates, the priests, and the whole Senate, with great part of the people, went out to meet him. Both the banks of the Tiber were covered with people, so that his entrance was in solemnity and honor, not inferior to a triumph. But it was thought somewhat strange, and looked like wilfulness and pride, that when the consuls and praetors appeared, he did not disembark, nor stay to salute them, but rowed up the stream in a royal galley, 6 banks of oars, and stopped not till he brought his vessels to the dock. However, when the money was carried through the streets, the people much wondered at the vast quantity of it, and the Senate being assembled decreed him in honorable terms an extraordinary praetorship, and also the privilege of appearing at the public speeches in a robe faced with purple. Cato declined all these honors, but declining what diligence and fidelity he had found in Nicias, the steward of Ptolemy, he requested the Senate to give him his freedom. And there's, of course, issues with the whole pride thing and displaying pride and announcing pride, even in, amongst the Romans of ancient times. Philippus, the father of Marcia, was that year consul, and the authority and power of the office rested in the manor in Cato. For the other consul paid him no less regard for his virtue's sake than Philippus did on account of the connection between them, and Cicero, now being returned from his banishment, into which he was driven by Claudius, and having again obtained great credit among the people, went into absence of Claudius, and by force took away the records of his tribuneship, which had been laid up in the Capitol. We see something similar going on in my country, is that they had full records of something, and as records have disappeared, and witnesses have gone silent, and things have been edited. They're now working on different things, right? Hereupon the Senate was assembled, and Claudius complained of Cicero, who answered that Claudius was never legally tribune, and therefore whatever he had done was void and of no authority. But Cato interrupted him while he spoke, and at last, standing up, said that indeed he in no way justified or approved of Claudius's proceedings, but if they questioned the validity of what had been done in his tribuneship, they might also question what himself had done at Cuprus, for the expedition was unlawful. If he that sent him had no lawful authority for himself, he thought Claudius was legally made tribune, who by the permission of the law was from a patrician adopted into a plebeian family. If he had done ill in his office, he ought to be called to account for it, but the authority of the magistracy ought not to suffer for the faults of the magistrate. Cicero took this ill, and for a long time discontinued his friendship with Cato, but they were afterwards reconciled. Pompey and Crassus, by agreement with Caesar, who crossed the Alps to see them, had formed a design that they too should stand to be chosen consuls a second time, and when they should be in their office, they would continue to Caesar his government for 5 years more, and take to themselves the greatest provinces, with armies and money to maintain them. This seemed a plain conspiracy to subvert the constitution and parcel out the empire. Several men of high character had intended to stand to be consuls that year, but upon the appearance of these great competitors, they all desisted, except only Lucius Domitius, who had married Porcia, the sister of Cato, and was by him persuaded to stand it out, and not abandon such an undertaking which he said was not merely to gain the consulship but save the liberty of Rome. In the meantime, it was the common topic among the more prudent part of the citizens that they might not suffer the power of Pompey and Crassus to be united, which would then be carried beyond all bounds and become dangerous to the state, that therefore one of them must be denied. For these reasons they took part with Domitius, whom they exhorted and encouraged to go on, assuring him that many who feared openly to appear before him would privately assist him. Pompey's party, fearing this, laid wait for Domitius, and set upon him as he was going before daylight with torches into the field. First, he that bore the light, next before Domitius, was knocked down and killed. Then several others being wounded, all the rest fled, except Cato and Domitius, whom Cato held, though himself were wounded in the arm, and crying out, conjured the others to stay, and not, while they had any breath, forsake the defense of their liberty against those tyrants who plainly showed with what moderation they were likely to use the power which they endeavored to gain by such violence. But at length Domitius, also no longer willing to face the danger, fled to his own house, and so Pompey and Crassus were declared elected. Nevertheless, Cato would not give over, but resolved to stand himself to be praetor that year, which he thought would be some help to him in his design of opposing them, that he might not act as a private man when he was to contend with public magistrates. Pompey and Crassus apprehended this, and fearing that the office of praetor in the person of Cato might be equal in authority to that of consul, they assembled the Senate unexpectedly, without giving notice, to a great many of the senators, and made an order that those who were chosen praetors should immediately enter upon their office, without attending the usual time, which, according to the law, they might be accused if they had corrupted the people with gifts. When, by this order, they had got leave to bribe freely, without being called to account, they set up their own friends and dependents to stand for the praetorship, giving money and watching the people as they voted. Yet the virtue and reputation of Cato was like to triumph over all these stratagems, for the people generally felt it to be shameful that a price should be paid for the rejection of Cato, who ought rather to be paid himself to take upon him the office. So he carried it by the voices of the first tribe. Hereupon Pompey immediately framed a lie, crying out, it thundered, and straight broke up the assembly. For the Romans religiously observed this as a bad omen, and never concluded any matter after it had been thundered. Before the next time they had distributed larger bribes, and driving also the best men out of the field. By these foul means they procured Vatinius to be chosen praetor instead of Cato. It is valid that those who had thus corruptly and dishonestly given their voices hurried, as if it were in flight, out of the field, the others staying together and exclaiming at the event. One of the tribunes continued the assembly, and Cato, standing up, as it were by inspiration, foretold all the miseries that afterwards befell the state, exhorted them to beware of Pompey and Crassus, who were guilty of such things, and had laid such designs that they might well fear to have Cato praetor. When he had ended his speech, he was followed to his house by a greater number of the people than all the new praetors elect put together. Caius Trebonius now proposed the law for allotting provinces to the consuls, one of whom was to have Spain and Africa, the other Egypt and Syria, with full power of making war and carrying it on both by sea and land as they should think fit. When this was proposed, all others despaired of putting any stop to it, and neither did nor said anything against it. But Cato, before the voting began, went up into the place of speaking, and, desiring to be heard, was with much difficulty allowed 2 hours to speak, having spent that time in informing them, and reasoning with them, and in foretelling to them much that was to come. He was not suffered to speak any longer, but he was going on. A sergeant came and pulled him down. That's, you don't usually see that spelled with a J, but because usually you see a sergeant spelled with a. Anyways, yet when he was down, he still continued speaking in a loud voice, and found many to listen to him and join in his indignation. Then the sergeant took him and forced him out of the forum, but as soon as he got home, he returned again to the place of speaking. The place of speaking, crying out to the people to stand by him. When he had done thus several times, Trebonius grew very angry and commanded him to be carried to prison. But the multitude followed him and listened to the speech which he made to them as he went along, so that Trebonius began to be afraid again and ordered him to be released. Thus that day was expended, and the business staved off by Cato. But in the days succeeding, many of the citizens, being overawed by fears and threats, and others won by gifts and favors, Aquilius, one of the tribunes, they kept by an armed force within the Senate house. Cato, who cried it, thundered, and they drove out of the forum. Many were wounded, and some slain, and at length, by open force, they passed the law. At this, many were so incensed that they got together and were going to throw down the statues of Pompey, but Cato went and diverted them from that design. And we see that going on, well, at least while I'm doing this video, is that people don't like the law. And, if it's in what they want, they're okay with it. But if the majority of the people in power and the majority of the country wants something, or at least doesn't want to be forced into something, but it's not what they personally want, violence in the streets and stuff, attacking public officials, and why public officials want statues and stuff of themselves is kind of, Again, another law was proposed concerning the provinces and legions of Caesar. Upon this occasion, Cato did not apply himself to the people, but appealed to Pompey himself and told him that he did not consider now that he was setting Caesar upon his own shoulders, who would shortly grow too weighty for him, and at length not be able to lay down the burden, nor yet bear it any longer. He would precipitate both it and himself with it upon the Commonwealth, and then he would remember Cato's advice, which was no less advantageous to him than just and honest in itself. Thus was Pompey often warned, but still disregarded and slighted it, never mistrusting Caesar's change, and always confiding in his own power and good fortune. Cato was made praetor the following year, but it seems he did not do more honor and credit to the office by his signal integrity than he disgraced and diminished it by his strange behavior. Well, just being strange shouldn't be a disgrace, for he would often come to the court without his shoes and sit upon the bench without any undergarment, and in this attire would give judgment in capital cases and upon persons of the highest rank. Well, it's kind of creepy trying to figure out if somebody has underwear on. I don't think there's public officials wearing underwear. It's like, what's wrong with you, dude? It is said also he used to drink wine after his morning meal and then transact the business of his office. But this was wrongfully reported of him. The people were at that time extremely corrupted by the gifts of those who sought offices, and most made a constant trade of selling their voices. Cato was eager utterly to root this corruption out of the commonwealth. He therefore persuaded the Senate to make an order that those who were chosen into any office, though nobody should accuse them, should be obliged to come into the court and give account upon oath of their proceedings in their election. This was extremely obnoxious to those who stood for the offices, and yet more to those vast numbers who took the bribes, insomuch that one morning, as Cato was going to the tribunal, a great multitude of people flocked together, and with loud cries and maledictions reviled him, and threw stones at him. Those that were about the tribunal presently fled, and Cato himself, being forced thence, and jostled about in the throng, very narrowly escaped the stones that were thrown at him, and with much difficulty got hold of the rostra, where, standing up with a bold and undaunted countenance, he at once mastered the tumult, and silenced the clamor, and addressing them in fit terms for the occasion, was heard with great attention, and perfectly quelled the sedition. Afterwards, on the Senate commending him for this. But I, said he, do not commend you for abandoning your praetor in danger and bringing him no assistance. In the meantime the candidates were in great perplexity, for every one dreaded to give money himself, and yet feared lest his competitors should. At length they agreed to lay down 125,000 drachmas apiece, and then all of them to canvass fairly and honestly, on condition that if anyone was found to make use of bribery, he should forfeit the money. Being thus agreed, they chose Cato to keep the stakes and arbitrate the matter. To him they brought the sum concluded on, and before him subscribed the agreement. The money he did not choose to have paid for them, but took their securities, who stood bound for them. Upon the day of election he placed himself by the tribune, who took the votes, and very watchfully observing all that passed, he discovered one who had broken the agreement, and immediately ordered him to pay his money to the rest. They, however, commending his justice highly, remitted the penalty, as thinking the discovery a sufficient punishment. It raised, however, as much envy against Cato as it gained him reputation, and many were offended at thus taking upon himself the whole authority of the Senate, the courts of judicature, and the magistracies. For there is no virtue, the honor and credit for which procures a man more odium than that of justice, and this because, more than any other, it acquires a man power and authority among the common people, for they only honor the valiant and admire the wise, while in addition they also love just men and put entire trust and confidence in them. They fear the bold man and mistrust the clever man, and moreover think them rather beholding to their natural complexion than to any goodness of their will. For these excellencies they look upon valor as a certain natural strength of mind, and wisdom as a constitutional acuteness, whereas a man has it in his power to be just, if he have but the will to be so, and therefore injustice is thought the most dishonorable, because it is least excusable. Cato, upon this account, was opposed by all the great men, who thought themselves reproved by his virtue. Pompey especially looked upon the increase of Cato's credit as the ruin of his own power, and therefore continually set up men to rail against him. Among these was the seditious Claudius, now again united to Pompey, who declared openly that Cato had conveyed away a great deal of the treasure that was found in Cyprus, and that he hated Pompey only because he refused to marry his daughter. Cato answered that although they had allowed him neither horse nor man, he had brought more treasure from Cyprus alone than Pompey had after so many wars and triumphs from the ransacked world, that he never sought the alliance of Pompey. Not that he thought him unworthy of being related to him, but because he differed so much from him in things that concerned the commonwealth. For, said he, I laid down the province that was given me when I went out of my praetorship. Pompey, on the contrary, retains many provinces for himself, and he bestows many on others. But now he sent Caesar a force of 6,000 men into Gaul, which Caesar never asked the people for, nor had Pompey obtained their consent to give, men and horse and arms, in any number, are become the mutual gifts of private men to one another, and Pompey, keeping the titles of commander and general, hands over the armies and provinces to others to govern, while he himself stays at home to preside at the contests of the canvass, and to stir up tumults at elections. Out of the anarchy he thus creates among us, seeking, we see well enough, a monarchy for himself. Thus he retorted on Pompey. Thus he reported on Pompey. He had an intimate friend and admirer of the name Marcus Favonius, much the same as Cato, as we are told Apollodorus, the Valerian, was in old-time Socrates. I don't remember how he spells Socrates, but I don't think that's the way to pronounce it. Whose words used to throw him into perfect transports and ecstasies. Getting into his head like strong wine and intoxicating him to a sort of frenzy. This Favonius stood to be chosen aedile, and was like to lose it, but Cato, who was there to assist him, observed that all the votes were written in one hand, and discovering the cheat, appealed to the tribunes, who stopped the election. Favonius was afterwards chosen aedile, and Cato, who assisted him in all things that belonged to his office, also undertook the care of the spectacles that were exhibited in the theatre, giving the actors crowns not of gold, but of wild olive, such as used to be given at the Olympic Games, and instead of the magnificent presents that were usually made, he offered the Greeks beetroot, lettuces, radishes, and pears, and to the Romans earthen pots of wine, pork, figs, cucumbers, and little faggots of wood. Faggot isn't like a, twig. Did they put this all in the same pot? Some ridiculed Cato for his economy. Others looked with respect on this gentle relaxation of his usual rigor and austerity. In fine, Favonius himself mingled with the crowd, and sitting among the spectators, clapped and applauded Cato, bade him bestow rewards on those who did well, and called on the people to pay their honors to him. As for himself, he had placed his whole authority in Cato's hands. At the same time, Curio, the colleague of Favonius, gave very magnificent entertainments in another theatre, but the people left his and went to those of Favonius, which they much applauded, and joined heartily in the diversion, seeing him act the private man, and Cato the master of the shows, who, in fact, did all this in derision of the great expenses that others incurred, and to teach them that in amusements men ought to seek amusement only, and the display of a decent cheerfulness, not great preparations and costly magnificence demanding the expenditure of endless care and trouble about things of little concern. Well, would agree with that. It's about, your enjoyment rather than mere luxury. But I would also say that the development, like with music, the developmental and the devotional music can bring about entertainment, and same thing with other things too. Is the developmental and the devotional can enhance your enjoyment of life. After this, Scipio, Hypsaeus, and Milo stood to be consuls, and that not only with the usual and now recognized disorders of bribery and corruption, but with arms and slaughter, and every appearance of carrying their audacity and desperation to the length of actual civil war, whereupon it was proposed that Pompey might be empowered and preside over that election. This Cato first opposed, saying that the laws ought not to seek protection from Pompey, but Pompey from the laws. Yet the confusion lasting a long time, the forum continually, as it were, besieged with 3 armies, and no possibility appearing of a stop being put to these disorders, Cato at length agreed that, rather than fall into the last extremity, the Senate should freely confer all on Pompey, since it was necessary to make use of a lesser illegality as a remedy against the greatest of all, and better to set up a monarchy themselves than to suffer a sedition to continue that must certainly end in one. Bibulus, therefore a friend of Cato's, moved the Senate to create Pompey sole consul, for that either he would reestablish the lawful government, lawful government, unlawful government, it's point of view, right? Because even if it's not lawful by one system, even the system of that country, well, it's lawful to me. Which brings up the importance of having a higher law than just what the government has decided on, right? Not that you disobey the government, I'm just saying, or they should serve under the master. Cato stood up, and contrary to all expectation, seconded the motion, concluding that any government was better than mere confusion, and that he did not question but Pompey would deal honorably and take care of the commonwealth. Thus committed to his charge, Pompey, being hereupon declared consul, invited Cato to see him in the suburbs. When he came, he saluted and embraced him very kindly, acknowledged the favor he had done him, and desired his counsel and assistance in the management of this office. Cato made answer that what he had spoken on any former occasion was not out of hate to Pompey, nor what he had now done out of love to him, but all for the good of the commonwealth, that in private, if he asked him, he would freely give his advice, and in public, though he asked him not, he would always speak his opinion, and he did accordingly. For first, when Pompey made severe laws for punishing and laying great fines on those who had corrupted the people with gifts, Cato advised him to let alone what was already past, and to provide for the future. For if he should look up past misdemeanors, it would be difficult to know where to stop, and if he would ordain new penalties, it would be unreasonable to punish men by a law, which at that time they had not the opportunity of breaking. Afterwards, when many considerable men, and some of Pompey's own relations were accused, and he grew remiss and disinclined to the prosecution. Cato sharply reproved him and urged him to proceed. Pompey had made a law also to forbid the custom of making commendatory orations in behalf of those that were accused, yet he himself wrote one for Manatius, Plancus, and sent it while the cause was pleading, upon which Cato, who was sitting as one of the judges, stopped his ears with his hands, and would not hear it read, whereupon Plancus, before sentence was given, accepted against him, but was condemned notwithstanding, and indeed Cato was a great trouble and perplexity to almost all that were accused of anything, as they feared to have him one of their judges, yet did not dare to demand his exclusion, and many that had been condemned because by refusing him they seemed to show that they could not trust their own innocence, and it was a reproach thrown in the teeth of some by their enemies that they had not accepted Cato for their judge. And one of the important things is if there is some sort of prosecuting attorney sort of thing going on, there should be defense attorneys, but nobody should be allowed to twist the facts or whatever. The argument should be for truth, not in the meanwhile, Caesar kept close with his forces in Gaul, and continued in arms, at the same time employed his gifts, his riches, and his friends above all things, to increase his power in the city. And now Cato's old admonitions began to rouse Pompey out of the negligent security in which he lay, into a sort of imagination of danger at hand. But seeing him slow and unwilling, and timorous to undertake any measures of prevention against Caesar, Cato resolved himself to stand for the consulship, and presently forced Caesar either to lay down his arms or discover his intentions. Both Cato's competitors were persons of good position. Sulpicius, who was one, owed much to Cato's credit and authority in the city, and it was thought unhandsome and ungratefully done to stand against him. Not that Cato himself took it ill, for it is no wonder, said he, if a man will not yield to another in that which he esteems the greatest good. He had persuaded the Senate to make an order that those who stood for offices should themselves ask the people for their votes, and not solicit by others, nor take others about with them to speak for them in their canvass. And this made the common people very hostile to him, if they were to lose not only the means of receiving money, but also the opportunity of obliging several persons, and so to become by his means both poor and less regarded. Besides this, Cato himself was by nature altogether unfit for the business of canvassing, as he was more anxious to sustain the dignity of his life and character than to obtain the office. Thus, by following his own way of soliciting, and not suffering his friends to do those things which take away the multitude, he was rejected and lost the consulship. But whereas upon such occasions, not only those who missed the office, but even their friends and relations used to feel themselves disgraced and humiliated, and observed a sort of mourning for several days after, Cato took it so unconcernedly that he anointed himself and played at ball in the field, and having breakfasting, went into the forum, as he used to do, without his shoes or his tunic, and there walked about with his acquaintance. Cicero blames him for that, when affairs required such a consul, he would not take more pains, nor condescend to pay some court to the people, as also because that he afterwards neglected to try again, whereas he had stood a second time to be chosen praetor. Cato answered that he lost the praetorship the first time, not by the voice of the people, but by the violence and corrupt dealings of his adversaries, whereas in the election of consuls there had been no foul play, so that he plainly saw the people did not like his manners, which an honest man ought not to alter for their sake. nor yet would a wise man attempt the same thing again while liable for the same prejudices. Caesar was at this time engaged with many warlike nations and was subduing them at great hazards. Among the rest, it was believed that he had set upon the Germans in a time of truce and had thus slain 300,000 of them, upon which some of his friends moved the Senate for a public thanksgiving, but Cato declared